everybody. Well, welcome. That's everybody's starting to come in from the waiting room. We've got another lovely high number of people wanting to come and join the conversation today. So let me kick us off by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands, the unceded lands. I'm here in Canberra, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and paying respects to all the elders, past and present, acknowledging people are coming from all over Australia, from the different lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and again, all unceded lands. So I'm Sharon Friel. Welcome to the Saving the World webinar series that we run through the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. And as you know, each month we tackle a subject that's really about trying to understand how to transform the consumptogenic system, this incredibly harmful system that extracts, produces, encourages hyperconsumption of natural resources, and at the same time is concentrating wealth, all of which is really bad for the environment, really bad for social equity, and really bad for health. And so in the hothouse, our research and our engagement is all about trying to change all of that. So no small challenge. And this year, as you know, we're getting to hear about the work that we've been doing in the hothouse. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Chelsea Hunnisett. Chelsea is one of the laureate PhD candidates, and she's going to tell you more about her work in a second. But she's also our Senior Government Relations Officer, drawing on her many years of policy advocacy experience and expertise. And what Chelsea has been doing through her PhD work and through that role is really at the edge of trying to understand what the possibilities are for embedding a well-being economy through different institutional processes. So with no further ado, Chelsea, over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, for that intro. I'm just going to share my screen and get my slides up for everybody. Where am I?
Perfect.
All right, can everybody see that? We're good to go? Lovely. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. I love presenting to people and having really robust conversations about things. So I'm really looking forward to taking questions and hearing your thoughts on my presentation today. The goal is definitely to stimulate some discussion on how to have an economy that serves all people living in Australia and not just a wealthy few. And I'll be drawing on, as Sharon said, my policy and advocacy government relations background to talk about some of the politics of implementing a wellbeing economy, but then also drawing on my own PhD research to talk about the possibilities of implementation and what that might look like. And hopefully we can build some enthusiasm for looking at the economy in a different way, its purpose, who it serves, and how it serves them. And I'm really looking forward to taking questions at the end. So get right into it. And just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we all live and work. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. So, as Sharon always says at the Hot House, we aren't doing research for research's sake. We're here to do research that can make a difference. And so in today's session, the 30th of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse's Saving the World seminar series, we're not going to be able to actually save the world, but I'm really hoping to build a good case as to why tackling the economy is a really good place to start. Now, when I first started my career, I was really interested in health as an enabler for living a good life. It seemed to me that if we could support people to be in better health and for longer, we could facilitate a lived experience that was characterized by, among other things, community participation, a positive family life, and the fostering of dignity through work. But no matter what issue I was looking at for almost 15 years, whether that be non-communicable diseases, the impacts of the climate crisis, like housing, food and water insecurity, heat stress, or the proliferation of unhealthy products like food and alcohol and vapes, it became really clear to me that what sat at the heart of the challenges of addressing these issues was always the same thing, and that was the economy, the distortions within the economy. And so, you'd go up to Parliament, you'd be talking to government about addressing any of these issues, and you'd always be told about needing to be realistic in a resource-constrained environment. Because when we're talking about health in the economy, usually what we're talking about is funding. We're constantly told in the health sector that resources are tight, that there isn't enough money to do all the things that need to be done, and so trade-off choices have to be made. And the health sector's got really good at doing that. We spend a lot of time and energy doing cost-benefit analysis. We focus on bang for buck and making those trade-off decisions. And more often than not, we're accepting incremental change to see any improvement to population health. And don't get me wrong, the government does spend a significant portion of the budget on healthcare. And we have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. But after almost 15 years of hearing the same flavor of rejection, the same reason why more was too much to ask for, why there wasn't enough money to go around, I realized that actually it wasn't just that health was expensive to fund, it was that we'd rather just spend the money on something else. In a country as wealthy and as privileged as Australia, perhaps the problem is that we are actually striving for gains within an economic system that is never going to meaningfully address the fundamentals of health, and that is what we should be seeking to change. Now, friend of the Hothouse, Richard Dennis at the Australia Institute, talks a lot about the budget being the manifestations of political choices and not just the accounting of spending according to the national interest, right? So these documents, they're political choices and they come from the interpretation of what a political cost might look like. So, for example, when some countries are choosing to spend money on subsidizing childcare or making university free, we choose to spend money on subsidizing fossil fuel companies. And while I can accept that you can't look at any single line item on a budget in a vacuum, it's a little hard to stomach cuts to the NDIS on the same day it's announced that billions are going to be spent on developing drones. I'm not an expert in defense, full transparency, and clearly the NDIS is costing us a lot more than we initially thought it would. So perhaps this was the right choice for that day, that period of time. But what that kind of choice tells me is that the current politics of the economy means that the government is less fearful of demonizing the disability sector than appearing soft on defense in the media cycle. And at a time where cost of living is top of everyone's mind, the refusal to implement a widely popular 25% gas tax that could bring new revenue and support struggling Australians, the idea that there just isn't enough money to go around doesn't really hold much water. Could it be that actually the gas tax is unpopular with some really powerful people in our society? And the political calculation is that it's better to reject the gas tax than appear soft on economic growth. The license to make these kinds of choices has to change if we want to improve health. And so the politics of the economy sits within, and these choices, sits within what we at the Hothouse call the consumptogenic system, which Sharon mentioned at the start. And this consumptogenic system is the institutions, policies, business practices, and social norms that embed and entrench principles of extractive capitalism and colonialism. It's a system that's fostered and perpetuated an economic environment that chooses to prioritize economic churn, often at the cost of health and well-being gains. And in short, that system is maintaining too high rates of ill health, and as climate change accelerates, our options and opportunities are running out to change it. Now, the challenging part is tackling an entire economic system, particularly now. It can feel too big, too unwieldy, and that we lack the technocratic expertise to do it. But if we really want to address health, then we're going to have a look at the economic system that's driving the status quo. And the well-being economy is an interesting idea, a proposed alternative that reimagines the economic system from an institutional focus on growth and development, capital accumulation, to one that ensures that humans can flourish on a safe planet. It does this by using principles of holistic well-being and success with metrics focused on health, environment, and equity, instead of metrics focused on economic outputs like productivity, deficit, inflation. It prioritizes the social and environmental benefits and trade-offs of economic activity and deprioritizes the need to sustain economic churn of growth for growth's sake. Importantly, the well-being economy is not about measurement of the possible outcomes of various policies, but tackling the entire system that is entrenching well-being harming policy. Now, there are some real political challenges to this idea that are legitimate. There are these ingrained assumptions about the benefits of growth that grow out of an education system that focuses on very specific norms. There's, to achieve a well-being economy, a total shift in thinking of the electorate would be required. We're talking about entrenched thinking, entrenched ways of understanding the economy. There would be changes needed in the architecture of the government. And then there would need to be a careful management of trade-offs to ensure that people aren't left behind in the bureaucratic process and churn. But despite these political challenges, the appeal of a well-being economy, in my mind, remains. Instead of working within an economic system that broke what we're trying to fix, we could seek to change the economic system, despite the complexity, to prioritize health by default via a well-being economy. Now, interestingly, there are several jurisdictions around the world who've already undertaken this work. For those of you who aren't familiar, the countries of Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, Scotland, Wales, and Canada make up the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership. There's also a bunch of local authorities and state-based authorities who are doing this kind of work, where they're seeking to shift the politics of the economy towards well-being and away from that consumptogenic system that we're talking about. Each has gone about it in a different way, using different bureaucratic methods, to do so. But importantly, the necessary license to change the political environment, to change the economic environment, was brought about in several jurisdictions by undertaking a wide-ranging public consultation with the population of those jurisdictions to understand exactly what needed to change for the betterment of well-being. One of the more well-known examples is that of the nation-building project in Wales, which culminated in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So that came about after 1997, when the Welsh devolution referendum, Wales became partially governed through the GWA Act in 1998. And the GWA established the Welsh Parliament and included a provision to embrace sustainable development ambition in government activities, which was kind of the big talking point at the time. This inclusion represented an important milestone in the development of Welsh institutional identity away from the consumptogenic system. Because by enshrining sustainable development institutionally, Wales set itself apart from other developed nations in that it sought to look beyond the material to redefine what national success might look like. After the GWA, Wales went through a more than 10-year period of national identity building, expanding their powers to legislate separately from the UK, and importantly, undertaking the Wales that we want in 2014, which was a national conversation to set national priorities. This process built momentum across a diverse range of interests for a more targeted and tangible approach to sustainable development. Out of the national conversation and the National Identity Building Project, the Act was born. The national conversation helped create political legitimacy for reform. Rather than imposing change technocratically, the process built public ownership around a new national narrative of well-being, sustainability, and intergenerational responsibility. It helped to shift the political license to change the way the economy and the broader business of government was run. So naturally, for me as a practitioner, these ideas led me to consider what might be possible in the Australian context. When it came time for me to do my PhD, it felt like a really interesting topic to see what it might look like in Australia. So, should the Australian government seek to develop a wellbeing economy, it's highly likely that it'll go into Commonwealth Treasury and that they would have responsibility for it. In Australia, there is no more important economic institution than that of Commonwealth Treasury. It's the chief economic advisor. They provide the economic advice that's in the national interest, and their role is to anticipate and analyse policy issues with a whole of economy perspective, understand government stakeholder circumstances, and respond rapidly to changing events and directions. It looks at areas like budget, taxation, the financial sector, foreign investment, super, and housing. And the Treasury reports to the Treasurer, who's widely considered the second most powerful person in the country and sits within the executive branch of government. Along with Cabinet colleagues and the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, with the support of policy advice from the Treasury, makes important economic policy decisions that are informed by the democratic process of elections. Now, Commonwealth Treasury has a bunch of agencies that are on the slide there. I put that up just to show you the breadth of work going on. In addition to what I've said, it's a massive agency, a couple of thousand employees at this point. And some of these agencies are kind of independent statutory authorities and others serve as advisory bodies on key policy issues, but they all culminate in the material influence of Treasury. All of that under its remit makes Treasury an organisation of significant importance in the governance of Australia's economy, precisely because of its material influence. But when it comes to the development of a wellbeing economy, are they the best choice? What license do they have to undertake the work? Are their institutional arrangements and authorities sufficient to achieve such complex change? In short, can the possibility of the wellbeing economy be achieved in an institution like Commonwealth Treasury? Now, my PhD is seeking to understand that question by exploring the material, the social, and the discursive authority dynamics of Commonwealth Treasury. And I won't get into all kind of the academic language behind that, but those dynamics are really important to how an institution goes about its work and the social license in different fields of society in order to do the work that it does. So, in first seeking to understand whether Treasury was a good venue for the wellbeing economy, I really wanted to understand if they had done any similar work in the past. So I did this document analysis of key policy in the last 25 years and came up with three key examples. The first is the Treasury's Wellbeing Framework, which was around between 2001 and 2014. The framework was largely an internal mechanism for Treasury, so it wasn't an outward policy through which policy advice could consider wellbeing impacts and beyond the immediate economic outcomes that advice is kind of filtered through up to the Treasurer. The framework sought to advance the wellbeing component of Treasury's mission statement by providing advice to government underpinned by wellbeing ambitions. And at the time, leadership of Treasury really focused on cultural change, cultural shifts in how Treasury officials considered the priorities of the economy and the trade-offs of the economy. While not a wellbeing economy, this framework connected wellbeing to economic concepts that had great translation in Treasury, so things like capabilities and utility, with the hopes of better fulfilling its intergenerational stewardship role of the economy. The second framework in the analysis that I identified took the form of alternative measures of economic success. So this really focused on how to understand well-being, what well-being might be. The ABS took this approach between 2002 and 2014 and focused on progress, so moving forward, things getting better for society. It was developed by the ABS, which is an agency under Treasury that sought to highlight alternative metrics. The framework had a companion dashboard that displayed easily distilled statistical information on wellbeing domains, which is very much within the comfort level of Treasury. While also not being a wellbeing economy, the ABS sought to develop a tool that could be easily used by policymakers to consider metrics of success beyond the economic, which was a big shift, a really important cultural shift. And then the third and final piece that I identified is the contemporary Measuring What Matters framework. Now, that framework, many people on this call are probably familiar with. It was created in 2023 and it's still in use today. It operates under a hybrid arrangement between Treasury and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and also takes a measurement approach and also has a dashboard where these easily distilled information is conveyed, which highlights the key areas of development under a number of different domains that then policymakers may be able to use to inform policy decisions. In addition, the Measuring What Matters framework also has a statement, which is the priorities of the framework that gets developed by the government, and that is currently under redevelopment and should be released later this year. Now, again, none of these are a wellbeing economy. They do demonstrate that Treasury's capability to think beyond growth approaches to economic policy, to think bigger than traditional economic norms. And from these policies, we can see that with the right political will, ministers do have the ability to enable bureaucrats to think differently, to gather different kinds of data, to understand the status of well-being within different paradigms, which is an important step mechanism towards a well-being economy. Now, the next part of my research has focused on speaking to different experts and elites, people who have a professional or work-based understanding of the economic system, Commonwealth Treasury, and its ability to develop a wellbeing economy. I interviewed a bunch of senior public servants across the government. So I talked to people in Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasury, Finance, DQ, and then also in some of the Treasury agencies like the Productivity Commission and the ABS. I also spoke to ministers, their staffers across the government, as well as some key people in civil society and academia. And at this stage of the analysis, it's not complete. I'm still doing coding, but I can share some of the emerging themes that I think are really important when we're thinking about institutional capability to develop a wellbeing economy. So firstly, when it comes to Treasury, trust may be a crucial source of authority. Trust came up a lot in interviews. In Treasury, it was conveyed by all my stakeholder groups and is seemingly generated through confidence in Treasury officials' technical expertise. So the ability to understand the trade-offs and the professionalism of the policy advice that's delivered. Secondly, Treasury officers may use that trust as the authority to secure policy influence. While there were various interpretations in interviews of policy influence, what was increasingly emerging is that policy influence is important to Treasury officers and is a marker of their own personal success. So how they see themselves as contributing to the Treasury mission is directly related to how much they influence policy outcomes. Third, the Treasury has significant material authority, like I mentioned before, through its legislative powers and the breadth of its work, the agencies that sit underneath it. Sorry, I've just lost my spot. Fourth, policy influence, may well be a material authority that Treasury is limited by in terms of the deference given to the Treasurer to make decisions. So in Australia's system of government, Treasury is required to provide advice, and the Treasurer and Cabinet colleagues make the decisions on the policy that's undertaken. Treasury officials in my interviews conveyed that while the advice they give to government is of the highest rigour, the government of the day is the ultimate decision maker. It is underpinned by our democratic system. So because of that deference, advice may be tailored to known policy goals in advance of that advice being given to ensure that a policy officer can be influential. So if you know that a government in the election cycle have said that they're opposed to this, you're not going to use your time as a Treasury official trying to propose that thing that they're not against. You will find other ways of communicating that to those powers that be if it's really an important part of your policy advice. And it opens, this dynamic, it really opens an interesting question about proclivities towards frank and fearless within the public service as a central tenet. And finally, Treasury officials may carry relational authority through convening power. So, because Treasury is highly trusted, it's credible, it's influential, interviewees reported their desire to cultivate and maintain relationships with Treasury officials. Interviewees also reported that these dynamics support the ability for Treasury to convene and participate in governance committees across the government and with a variety of actors. And in doing so, they maintain their policy influence, right? So if Treasury calls, people attend the meeting. That is just the basic dynamic of how it seems to work. So then when it comes to the wellbeing economy, what the data so far that I'm looking at is indicating is that people aren't always sure what a wellbeing economy actually is and what it would mean for policy approaches. So academics and civil society interviewees could articulate the theory, the dominant guardrails, and when it came time to actually talking about policy implementation, there was oftentimes a lack of specificity. Generally speaking, government bureaucrats weren't sure how to make it real in policy development, and the executive branch in particular, so ministers, their staffers, they were really polarized by its ideational merits. So they had a lot of challenge with the idea of kind of collective financial norms. The idea of moving away from growth in particular was quite challenging in the executive branch. Some felt that it was compromising individual freedom, while others felt like anything less than full degrowth agenda of the economy was just a complete waste of time. In government, interviewees indicated that comfortability with the wellbeing indicators, so those measurement pieces that I was talking about earlier, but real discomfort with systems change. This may speak to the material ability to influence different policy changes, so they focus on the tools that they can. Within Treasury, developing indicators is familiar, and it's something that can be adjusted, but systemic changes to economic goals and norms would be a larger cultural task that's deeply complex. Some interviewees did emphasize that such a change wasn't possible, but that the governance of such a change would need serious consideration across government, not only in Treasury. Executive branch interviewees also spoke of the need to bring the public along and that this was unlikely given the amount of change that was required. There was this assumption that the public wouldn't like the idea. And finally, one of the central ideas of the wellbeing economy is to move beyond gross domestic product as a metric of economic success. But interestingly, many interviewees acknowledged the merits of that idea and indeed conveyed that they don't consider GDP in their advice as much as you might assume. But they did convey that GDP has its uses, right? So particularly in consistency in terms of international norms and standards, the use of GDP is around the world. It's globally normalized in economic discourses, which means that countries are able and jurisdictions are able to compare themselves against others. They have a common language that's really useful. So using GDP provides and fosters collaboration across jurisdictions that just makes life easier. So in terms of all that, what does it mean for a wellbeing economy to be situated within Commonwealth Treasury? My initial reflections at this point, and again, I'm still working through the data, but Treasury has a lot of authority that may be needed for a wellbeing economy. It has the material authority for implementation because it has this huge amount of breadth of coverage. It can really get into different aspects of the economy and it houses so much internal expertise. It also has the relational authority. It brings people together. It is powerful in that way, very influential in the minds of across the APS and within the executive branch. And also Treasury has this really strong relational relationship with the public. But where Treasury seems to be limited is ideationally. Because there's such a significant status quo, the power of that status quo, the power of the embedded economic norms like growth and capital accumulation and economic churn as being really important. There are some signals indicating that Treasury has limitations in terms of thinking differently in that way to be able to develop a wellbeing economy that would actually be a wellbeing economy. Which brings me back to this idea of the national conversation. The possibility of a wellbeing economy, building the social license for it, shifting the politics of the economy, may really come down to whether all people in Australia can fully and meaningfully engage in the process of change. A national conversation is one of the most important democratic mechanisms for ensuring that that occurs. I mentioned before, the Welsh example is a really powerful example of public engagement defining what the national identity is, what the nation's government is going to be working towards. Imagine a scenario where all people living in Australia, regardless of age, identity, location, creed, or the ability to have a lobbyist on the payroll, could have their say on what policy would help them live a better life. The national conversation may have the power to democratise policy decision making and create the Australia that we want. By revealing community perspectives and developing a wellbeing economy based on those perspectives, the social and political licence is built for the economy to make decisions informed by Australians and not what might be perceived as political risk or the influence of powerful people and industries. Right now, Foundations for Tomorrow, and full disclosure, I've been supporting Foundations for Tomorrow in this work. They're developing a development lab, which is looking to inform what a national conversation might look like in Australia to undertake this work. To me, this is one of the greatest possibilities for the development of a wellbeing economy in Australia that we have right now, because it could inform how Treasury might think about implementation by using the social license, by using the feedback from the Australian community about the type of economy and society that we want to live in. So if you haven't come across that, I suggest you jump online, give it a go, have a look. There's a bunch of reports and materials on there that might interest you. I'm conscious of time, and then I promised I'd keep it under 30 minutes. So I'll finish on just one important note to take away from the presentation, and that is that the economy is a series of political choices. It is not predetermined by anything other than humans. And so if humans have created it, then we can change it. If anyone's interested in getting in touch, my email is there, but I'm really looking forward to taking your questions. Thanks so much.